Thursday, 8:23 in the evening. A sidewalk noodle shop on Lexington Avenue, Asheville. Cole sat alone, bowl more than half full, water untouched. Long day. No real hurry. He had just pushed the bowl aside when a shadow stopped at his table. Young woman, oversized jacket, hair loose and tangled, backpack strap held with tape. Her eyes weren't asking for pity, they were calculating whether the question was safe. "Can I eat what you didn't finish?" Cole looked at the bowl, then at her, pushed it forward. 40 steps away, Marin Soul stopped mid-sidewalk and saw everything. He pulled out the chair across from him without asking, without explaining. Then he walked inside and came back with a full bowl, not the leftovers, a new one, hot, and set it in front of her like it was the obvious thing to do. Lena, the woman who ran the place, watched through the pass-through window. She was 60 years old and had seen enough of the world to know when something was none of her business. She brought the bowl out without a word. The young woman, Delia, she'd say her name was Delia, ate the way people eat when they're genuinely hungry but haven't forgotten how to have dignity. She didn't rush in a way that embarrassed herself. She didn't slow down to perform gratitude. She just ate, steadily, like someone who had learned that food, when it came, should be treated with respect. Cole watched without watching. He'd gotten good at that. In the rooms where he used to work, rooms with long tables and prepared remarks, and men who spoke carefully about poverty as a statistic, he had learned to read a person in the margins, the way they held their silverware, the angle of their shoulders. Delia had positioned herself closest to the door, the way you do when you've spent enough time in unfamiliar rooms that keeping an exit within reach becomes automatic. He waited until the bowl was nearly empty before he said anything. He asked her name. She told him. He didn't follow it with a second question, didn't ask where she was from or what happened or whether there was anyone she could call. He just let the name land and stayed quiet. She asked first, "What do you do?" Not small talk, an assessment. He recognized the difference. "Plumbing," he said. She looked at his hands, the calluses along his palm, the grease that had settled into the skin below his nails in a way that didn't wash out anymore. She nodded once. The answer matched the evidence. He went back inside, came out with a wrapped sandwich and a cardboard coffee cup, set them beside her without comment. She looked at the coffee. Most people gave food. The coffee was different. It meant someone had thought about the temperature outside, not just the empty stomach. "It's cold out," Cole said. That was the whole explanation. She took both. She didn't say thank you right then. She stood up, adjusted the one working strap of her backpack, and turned toward the street. The thank you came when she was already facing away from him, like she needed the distance between them before the words could come out. He heard it, didn't respond, let it sit. Across the street, Marin Soul had taken out her phone once. Professional reflex, a young woman, clearly without stable housing, a situation worth documenting, but she'd watched the man at the table and put the phone back in her coat pocket. He hadn't looked around once to see if anyone was watching him do a good thing. He hadn't explained himself to Lena, or to the woman, or to the empty street. He had simply pulled out a chair and ordered a bowl of soup and let another person eat in peace. Marin walked on, but slower than before. 15 minutes later, Cole's phone lit up on the table. A text from Jasper. "Dad, are you coming?" Cole checked the time. He left money on the table, more than the bill, picked up his jacket. Before he stepped off the curb, he looked once in the direction Delia had gone. The corner was dark. The street was empty. He turned and walked the other way. Marin was at her desk by 7:15 the next morning. There was no procedure that required her to do anything with what she had seen the night before. Delia, if that was even a legal name on file somewhere, was an adult. Adults living without housing were outside the mandatory intervention protocols of the Buncombe County Department of Social Services. Marin knew this. She also knew she hadn't slept. There had been a case in Charlotte. A child, not an adult. A child who hadn't existed in any system until 3 weeks after someone had first noticed and done nothing. Marin had been the supervisor on that case. The child was fine, eventually. Marin had never fully forgiven herself for the 3 weeks. She drove back to Lexington Avenue before the morning rush. Lena was restocking the condiment station when Marin walked up. She showed her badge. Asked about the man from last night. Lena was careful in the way people are careful when they've lived long enough to know that authorities showing up with questions don't always lead to good outcomes. But she answered, "Cole Hadley. He eats here most Thursday evenings." She paused, then added something Marin hadn't asked for. "He's a good man." Cole was 3 blocks away, crouched under a sink in a ground-floor apartment, when Marin knocked. She heard the sound of tools and water. He came to the door with grease on his hands and looked at her DSS badge and then at her face. His expression wasn't surprised. "I figured someone would come ask about last night," he said. They stood on the sidewalk. He told her what happened without elaboration. She asked if he knew where Delia was. "No," he said. "I didn't ask. I didn't want her to feel like showing up again was a risk." Marin went still for a moment. That was the right read on the situation. It was also an instinct that took most experienced caseworkers years to develop. Back at her desk, she typed his name into the state database. Cole Hadley, Asheville, North Carolina. Self-employed. Plumbing. No criminal record. Nothing unusual. She stared at the result for a moment, then typed the same name into a broader search. She wasn't sure why she added the second term Treasury Department, except that something about the way he had spoken, the precision of it, didn't match the magnetic sign on the side of his truck. The photograph came up from a 2018 congressional testimony archive. A man in a gray suit, hair neatly cut, seated behind a microphone placard that read his full name and his title, Senior Policy Economist, the author of the Federal Urban Poverty Framework that had been cited in more state-level budget hearings than any similar document in the decade, the man who had written the blueprint for programs like the one she was trying to build. He had resigned in 2021. No statement, no press release, no interview. He had simply stopped existing in the record the way people stop existing when they choose to. Marin set her phone face down on the desk. She looked out the window at the parking garage across the street. She didn't understand why a person would walk away from that kind of work and end up fixing pipes in western North Carolina, but she understood something else. Last night she had stood on that sidewalk and hesitated. She had taken out her phone and put it away and kept walking, and he, without a badge, without a protocol, without any obligation at all, had pulled out a chair. Delia came back the following Thursday. Same corner, same time. Cole was already there. He'd arrived 15 minutes early and ordered a second bowl before she appeared. Lena set it on the table without being asked. She had started doing that. There was no conversation about it. It was simply a fact now. The way certain things become facts without anyone deciding. This time, Jasper was with him. Cole had picked his son up first and come straight to the restaurant, the way they always spent Thursday evenings. When Delia came around the corner and stopped at the sight of a 9-year-old boy sitting in the chair she'd occupied the week before, Jasper looked up, slid his chair over to make room, and nodded at her the way adults nod at other adults when they're being polite but mean it. "What's your name?" he asked. Not hello. Not hi. Just the question, direct, because he wanted the actual answer. She told him. "Delia, I already marked this spot," Jasper said. He produced a composition notebook from under the table and opened it to a page dense with hand-drawn lines and small labeled symbols. It was a map, or something that functioned as a map in a system of notation that was entirely his own. He explained what each symbol meant with the gravity of someone presenting a formal document. Delia listened. Somewhere in the middle of the explanation, without planning to, she smiled. Small, quick, nearly nothing. The second Thursday, Marin showed up. She took a table across the restaurant, ordered coffee, and opened her laptop. She had told herself she was there professionally, a follow-up observation. Informal. Nothing that required documentation. Cole noticed her within 30 seconds of her sitting down. He didn't acknowledge her directly. He shifted his chair by a few inches, just enough to give her a cleaner angle on their table. The gesture had only one possible meaning. "I see you. It's fine." The third Thursday, she came to their table instead. She introduced herself to Delia by first name only. Delia measured her the way she measured everything, carefully, without expression. "What do you do?" she asked. Marin glanced at Cole for half a second. "Social services," she said. Something in Delia's posture changed. Not dramatic. Just the slight tightening of someone who has learned that certain titles come with consequences. Cole set down his spoon. "Marin's here because she wanted dinner," he said. He looked at Marin. Right, Marin said. Delia didn't entirely believe it, but she didn't leave. Later, while Cole walked Jasper to the truck, Marin and Delia stayed at the table. No one recorded what they said. When Cole came back, something in Delia's expression had shifted. Not trust, not quite, but the outer wall of it had moved back a few feet. At the end of the evening, Marin pulled Cole aside while Delia was looking at Jasper's notebook. The boy was in the middle of explaining the color-coding system. It was elaborate, and he was serious about it, and Delia was genuinely listening. "Do you know where she sleeps?" "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "No," Cole said, "because if you know, you have to follow procedure. And procedure right now would probably mean she doesn't come back next Thursday." Marin looked at him. "You're putting me in a difficult position." "I know. I'm sorry." Neither of them looked away. Marin finished the draft at 11 o'clock that night, sitting at her kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and a document she had technically started 3 months ago and never gotten past the second page. It was a proposal, safe harbor. She was calling it a framework that would allow community access points to provide voluntary support to people experiencing homelessness without triggering the mandatory administrative processes that most people experiencing homelessness had learned correctly to avoid. The idea wasn't new. What was new was that she finally believed she understood what had been missing from every previous version she'd seen. The first case she thought of when she wrote the section on intended beneficiaries wasn't a child, wasn't a family, wasn't any of the populations the proposal was technically designed to serve. It was a young woman who had asked a stranger for his unfinished bowl of noodles. She sent the draft to Cole at 11:42. She had his email address from the first meeting, written on the back of a receipt he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. She didn't include a note explaining why she was sending it to him, rather than to any of the policy consultants on her department's approved vendor list. She wasn't entirely sure she could have explained it. Cole read it the next morning between a 7 o'clock job and an 8:30. He sat in his truck in a gas station parking lot and read the whole thing. Then he replied with 3 questions. They were short. They went directly to the places where the legal language of the proposal created gaps that could be exploited or challenged. Marin read them at her desk and stopped moving for a moment. Those were not questions from someone outside the field. They met at a coffee shop 2 days later. The meeting had been scheduled as a 30-minute check-in. It ran for just over 2 hours. Cole came in work clothes, jacket still on, and pushed back on the state versus federal jurisdictional framing in her compliance section in a way that was precise without being combative. Marin held her ground on the parts she believed in and conceded the parts she couldn't. It was, she thought afterward, the most honest policy conversation she'd had since leaving Charlotte. Somewhere in the second hour she asked him directly, "Can you tell me who you actually are? I looked you up." Cole looked at his coffee cup. He was quiet long enough that it wasn't evasion. It was the pause of someone who had answered this question before and found all the available answers incomplete. "I'm a plumber in Asheville," he said. "The rest of it is who I used to be. Those 2 things aren't contradictory. For me they are." She heard the door in that, but she also heard the hinge. Before he left, he signed the section marked Initial Agreement in Principle. He picked up the pen, signed his name, and set the pen down without looking at the paper again. He was out the door before Marin looked at the signature. She sat with it for a while. She wasn't certain whether he had signed because he believed in the proposal, or because he had come to trust her, or because of something that didn't have a name yet in either of those categories. Councilman Terry Falk called Marin in for a closed meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 58 years old, and had been on Asheville City Council for 11 of them, long enough to have learned that the most effective way to stop something was rarely to oppose it directly. He kept a row of framed photographs on the credenza behind his desk, groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, handshakes with people whose names appeared on buildings. He pointed at none of them. He didn't need to. He told her he had concerns about Safe Harbor. Specifically, he was worried about the liability exposure the city would carry if a participant in an informally documented support arrangement was harmed. He said the word liability 4 times in 11 minutes. He was very good at sounding like he was worried about the right things. Then he offered a solution. He said that if Marin was committed to moving forward, she might consider partnering with organizations that had cleaner institutional structures. He had a list. He slid it across the conference table, the way people slide things when they want the gesture to look casual. Marin looked at the list. She recognized a few of the names recently incorporated nonprofits, all less than 3 years old, none of them with a track record she could point to. "I'll need some time to evaluate these," she said. Folk smiled. It was the answer he expected from someone 8 months into a new post. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 10 minutes after the meeting. Then she called Cole. It was the first time she had contacted him outside of anything work-related, and some part of her registered that fact even as she dialed. She wasn't calling because he was a policy expert. She had colleagues with more current credentials. She was calling because he already knew enough of the story that she didn't have to start from the beginning. She told him what Folk had said. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked for the names on the list. She read them out. He asked her to repeat 2 of them. She heard him writing. After the call, he sat in his truck and looked at what he'd written. He knew those names. Not from Asheville. From federal grant documentation he had reviewed in 2019, a set of organizations that had applied for pilot program funding through a housing initiative he had been building and that he had flagged for conflict of interest before the applications went anywhere. The channel had been blocked at the federal level. Apparently they had found another route. He looked at the list. Then he looked out the windshield toward Lexington Avenue, 2 blocks east, where the corner where he ate on Thursday evenings was visible from here if the light was right, and somewhere behind the market on the next block, in a lot he had walked past once on purpose and once by accident, a woman named Delia was sleeping in an abandoned truck. He crumpled the piece of paper, smoothed it back out, folded it carefully along a clean crease, tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket against his chest. Those 2 things, the list and the woman, had become the same thing in his mind. He didn't know when that had happened. He only knew that it had. Ruth Adler had been running Street Ambrose Community Kitchen on the north side of downtown Asheville for 22 years. She knew where every dollar in her operating budget came from, and where every dollar had come from before that, going back to the years when the kitchen was still housed in the basement of a church that no longer existed. She also knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched the city change around her, that money and power in a place like Asheville were not separate things. Cole came to her on a Wednesday morning. He laid the names from Folk's list on the table in front of her and watched her face. She read the list. She didn't say anything. She stood up, walked through the door at the back of the kitchen into the small office she'd occupied for 2 decades, and came back carrying a padded envelope, the color of old paper. She set it on the table beside the list. Inside were 3 letters. They were dated between 2017 and 2019. They were written on official City of Asheville letterhead and signed by Terry Folk, who at the time held the title of Deputy Council Chair. Each letter was addressed to the Executive Director of Street Ambrose, and each one expressed, in formal and carefully worded language, on a concern that the kitchen's participation in a federal grant pilot program would create what Folk called an inadvisable precedent of institutional dependence on federal funding streams. The program he had asked them to decline was the direct predecessor of the framework Cole had spent 3 years building at the Treasury Department. Folk had moved against it at the local level, while it was still in draft form before most people in Washington had heard of it, before it had a formal name, before Cole had ever set foot in Asheville, and Folk had no idea that the man now sitting across from Ruth, reading his own letters, was the person who had written the program he had tried to bury. Cole read all 3 letters. His hands were flat on the table when he finished. "You knew who I was," he said. "It wasn't a question. I figured it out about a year after you started coming around," Ruth said. "I kept waiting for the right moment. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Because you needed time. And because there wasn't a reason big enough yet." He looked at the envelope. "There is now." He scanned every page with his phone. That evening he forwarded the files to an email address he hadn't used in over 3 years, a former colleague at the Federal Government Accountability Office, who had been quietly tracking irregular funding patterns in municipal social services contracts in the Southeast. Cole didn't include a message. The documents explained themselves. That afternoon, before Thursday came, he drove to the lot behind the market on the north side of the block. He didn't knock on the window of the abandoned truck. He left a bag of food and a worn paperback book on the hood, a text on urban policy that he had read so many times the spine had cracked along the fold. The inside cover had his name in it, and below that, a Washington Library's return address. He was gone before Delia opened the door. Thursday evening, she set the book on the table between them. She had opened the front cover. She looked at the name. She looked at him. "This is yours," she said. "It's yours now." Cole said. The text came on a Tuesday. Not a Thursday, no pattern, no schedule. Just a message from a number Cole had given her on a slip of paper tucked into a bag of food 2 weeks earlier. Heavy rain tonight. The place I sleep is leaking. She hadn't asked him for anything. She had stated a fact. Cole understood the difference. He read the message at 9 o'clock sitting at his kitchen table, Jasper already asleep down the hall. He sat with the phone in his hand for 3 minutes. Then he wrote back, "Send me the address of where you're standing." He drove to her. She was on the sidewalk outside the market, backpack on, waiting in the rain with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting in conditions that weren't comfortable. He didn't take her to his house. He called Marin from the parking lot while Delia sat in the passenger seat with her wet jacket in her lap. "Delia needs a place tonight. I don't want to trigger an emergency intake. I don't know where her situation stands, and I don't want a flag in the system before we understand what we're working with. Can you help?" Marin arrived in 20 minutes. She didn't ask why he had called her instead of the county shelter line. He didn't explain. Some things don't require explanation when both people already understand the answer. Delia didn't want the emergency shelter. She didn't give a reason. She didn't need to. Cole and Marin both read what was underneath the silence, and neither of them pushed. Marin negotiated quietly, not pressure, not promises she couldn't keep, just options laid out clearly, honestly, without the institutional urgency that made people feel like they were being managed rather than helped. She had learned a long time ago that the difference between a person accepting help and a person disappearing from a conversation was rarely about the help itself. It was about whether they felt like they had a choice. Cole sat beside Delia through the whole conversation. He didn't speak for her. He didn't interpret for Marin. He was simply present, which was, it turned out, the thing that mattered. At one point, Delia glanced at him, a short, quick look, the kind that checks whether something is still true. He didn't move. She turned back to Marin. "Okay," she said. Marin arranged a room through a partner hotel the department used for temporary placements. She drove Delia there herself. Cole stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant and watched the car until it turned the corner and was gone. The night had gotten colder. He stood there longer than he needed to. On her way back through downtown, Marin stopped at a green light. The car behind her honked before she registered the change. She wasn't thinking about Delia. She was thinking about Cole, standing on that sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, watching the car leave. There was a specific quality to how he'd been standing that she couldn't stop turning over. It wasn't the posture of a man who had done a good deed and was ready to go home. It was the posture of someone worried about a person in particular. She had gone back for her jacket. She'd left it on a chair. Cole was still there, sitting on the hood of his truck in the dark. He got up when she came out, held the jacket out. Their hands touched in the exchange. Neither of them moved away immediately. "Were you waiting to return my jacket?" Marin asked. "No," Cole said. Folk scheduled the public budget hearing for a Thursday morning. He had asked Marin to present the department's quarterly performance review, which was standard, and to address questions about the safe harbor proposal, which was less standard but not unusual enough to raise an objection. He expected her to defend the proposal carefully and then, when pressed by the 2 council members he had already spoken to, agree to a timeline extension that would effectively shelve it until after the next election cycle. He had done this before with other programs and other directors. The mechanism was reliable. The night before the hearing, Marin received an email from an address she didn't recognize. Inside was a compressed folder. Inside the folder were scanned copies of 3 letters she had never seen before, the ones from Ruth's locked cabinet, along with 3 fiscal year budget documents from the city's Office of Finance showing a pattern of funds reallocated from social services and housing support into a municipal development partnership. A partnership that, if you traced the LLC structure carefully across 4 separate filings, led back to a private investment group in which Terry Falk held a non-disclosed equity position. Marin didn't know who had sent it. She didn't call Cole to confirm. She had already arrived at the answer before she picked up the phone, and she put it back down without dialing. She spent 2 hours that evening going through every page in the folder. By the time she went to bed, she had a legal pad covered in notes and a clear, quiet understanding of what she was going to do in the morning. She had been in this work long enough to know the difference between evidence that could shift a conversation and evidence that could end one. This was the second kind. She sat at the hearing table the next morning, with her original report in a folder she never opened. She had brought the documents instead. She asked Folk, directly and in front of a room that included 2 local journalists and a reporter from the state capital who had driven down for unrelated reasons, whether he could explain the sequential reallocation of housing support funds over 3 consecutive fiscal years into a development fund whose primary beneficiary organizations appeared on his recommended partner list for Safe Harbor. She asked the question with the same voice she used in staff meetings. Steady, clear, slightly too calm to be dismissed as emotional. Folk attempted a response about procedural complexity and multi-year planning cycles. The 2 council members he had prepped said nothing. The room held very still. The budget cut to Street Ambrose and 4 other community service organizations was tabled pending review. The Safe Harbor proposal was approved in principle for a 90-day pilot. Falk was not arrested. He was not publicly accused of anything. Real accountability rarely arrives in a single moment. It builds, quietly, in the record. He left the chamber knowing that someone had connected lines he had spent years keeping parallel, and that whoever had done it had given the information to someone who knew exactly what to do with it. The investigation that followed would take months. The outcome would not be dramatic, but from this morning forward, he would be watched. Cole watched the live stream from his truck, parked outside a job site he'd finish after lunch. He watched it all the way through, the phone propped against the dashboard, his coffee going cold in the cup holder. When Marin asked her final question and the room went quiet for 3 full seconds before Folk began his response, Cole reached over and turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. He sat for a moment with the engine off. That afternoon, he didn't text Marin. He texted Delia instead. "Did you watch?" she replied after 4 minutes. "Yeah, she's good." He looked at those 2 words for longer than 2 words require. Then he put the truck in drive. 3 weeks after the hearing, Safe Harbor began its pilot phase. Delia was the first person to enroll, not because anyone pressured her. Marin had asked once, plainly, and Delia had taken a short pause and then said yes. The program connected her with a transitional housing unit that had a legal address, which meant she could apply to re-enroll at the university as a student with extenuating circumstances. She submitted the application on a Wednesday afternoon from the computer lab of the public library on Haywood Street. She told Cole about it on Thursday evening, not as news she was reporting, but as something she was still figuring out how to say out loud. The way she talked about it was different from the way she'd talked about anything before. She wasn't measuring each word for risk. She spoke like someone who had something good to share and was trying to understand what that felt like. Jasper received the news of her re-enrollment with the solemn consideration it deserved. "Does your school have geography?" he asked. "Yes." "Then you'll find out where my maps are wrong," he said. He nodded once, as though this resolved something that had been bothering him. Delia looked at him. She laughed, not the small, quick, almost invisible laugh from the first night, but a full one, brief and real. Cole saw it and looked at his bowl. Jasper, satisfied with the outcome, went back to explaining the symbols in his current map, which had grown significantly in complexity since Delia had started coming on Thursdays. After Jasper went inside to talk to Lena about the soup, Cole and Delia stayed at the table. It was the first time they had sat alone without a problem to solve, or a decision to make, or a next step to discuss. There was no protocol between them tonight, no role he was filling, no category she was fitting into. Just 2 people at an outdoor table in October, with the street quieting down around them and the last of the evening light going flat on the pavement. He asked what she had been studying. She told him urban sociology, with a concentration in housing policy. She had chosen it before she lost her housing, which she said now with the dry, level tone of someone who had decided the irony was allowed to be funny. He laughed, quietly, surprised. She watched him do it. He listened to the rest without offering advice. He didn't tell her what he thought she should do next, or what he might have done differently at her age. He just asked a question when she paused, and another when she was ready, and let the conversation go where she took it. She had not often been listened to in a way that felt like the listener was actually following rather than waiting for an opening. She realized, somewhere in the middle of it, that she had been talking for 20 minutes without checking the exits. That was new. She noticed it the way you notice the absence of something that had always been there, not with relief, exactly, but with the particular quiet of something no longer being necessary. When she stood up to go, he stood at the same time. Not to walk her out, just the same movement, happening together. They went to the sidewalk. At the corner where the street split, they both stopped. Neither one stepped off first. "Will you be here next Thursday?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He didn't hesitate. He didn't add anything to it. She nodded and turned toward her street. He turned toward his truck. Neither of them looked back, but they both understood, in the way you understand something that doesn't need to be said, that next Thursday had already become a different kind of thing than the Thursdays before it. Whatever it was that had been building across all these weeks, across the bowls of soup and the notebook maps and the late-night phone calls and the jacket left on a chair, it had a different name now. Neither of them was going to say the name out loud. Not yet. But it was there, solid as the corner they had both stopped at, real as the fact that neither one had stepped off first. 14 months after the first Thursday, Cole's backyard held 7 people and a folding table with a cloth that Lena had brought from her own kitchen. The maple tree was turning deep orange, still holding most of its leaves, the afternoon light coming through at the low October angle that made everything look like it was already a memory being kept. It wasn't a large wedding. It wasn't meant to be. There was no venue, no guest list, no florist. There was Ruth, holding a small bunch of dahlias she had cut from her garden that morning. There was Marin, standing beside Delia with her hands folded in front of her. There was Jasper in a borrowed suit jacket that was too wide in the shoulders, standing next to Cole with the posture of someone taking his job very seriously. And there was the officiant from the Asheville City Clerk's office, a woman named Gail, who had done 312 of these, and approached each one with the same quiet professionalism. Delia wore a dress the color of a clear afternoon sky. She had chosen it because it was the color she had always liked best, and because for the first time in several years, she was in a position to choose something for that reason alone. Cole wore his dark flannel shirt, the one Lena had pressed that morning until the fold lines were straight. He had offered to wear something different. Delia had said the flannel was what she knew him in, and she wanted to know him in it today. The ceremony was short. When Gail asked if either of them wanted to say anything, Cole looked at Delia for a long moment. He hadn't prepared anything. He had thought about it and decided that preparing something would make it feel like a performance, and he had spent enough of his life in rooms where people performed the things they were supposed to feel. He wanted to say something true. "I don't have a lot of promises to make," he said, "but I have this one. I will always push the bowl toward you." No one laughed. No one didn't understand. When it was over, Jasper turned to Delia with the composed expression of a person who has been waiting to say something for the appropriate moment. "Do you want to see the new map? I redrew it. I put our house on it." She crouched down beside him. He opened the composition notebook to a new page. It was dense with his symbols, the ones she had learned by now, the ones she'd teased him about when she found out the triangles meant hills rather than mountains. And in the center of the page, marked darker than anything else, was a single point. Beside it, in his 9-year-old handwriting, he had written one word: home. She held the notebook for a while without giving it back. She traced the symbol at the center with her thumb. Then she handed it to him. "Don't redraw it," she said. "It's already right." Ruth opened the wine. Marin poured. Lena appeared from inside the kitchen. No one had formally invited her, but she had been there since 8 in the morning, cooking, and it would not have occurred to anyone to question this. And Cole stood in the yard and looked at the people around him. Ruth laughing at something Marin had said. Lena handing Jasper a plate and listening to him explain something with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. Delia watching all of it with the unhurried expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and knows it. He had not looked for any of this. He had not planned for it or worked toward it. He had gone to a noodle shop on a Thursday evening because the day had been long and he didn't want to go home yet. And a woman had stopped at his table and asked a question that cost her something to ask. One Thursday, one bowl. One question from a woman who wasn't sure it was safe, and a man who didn't hesitate. Neither of them had been looking. That was exactly why they had found each other.